Subscribe and like and comment and share please. The Farmer Prince. In the rolling hills of the Kingdom of Meridian, where golden wheat fields stretched as far as the eye could see, there lived a prince named Alexander who would one day challenge everything his people believed about royalty, duty, and the true meaning of leadership. Prince Alexander was born in the Grand Palace of Meridian, a magnificent structure of white marble and gleaming towers that overlooked the capital city. From his nursery windows, he could see the sprawling farmlands that fed his father's kingdom, patchworks of green and gold that changed with the seasons. While other princes learned only the arts of war, diplomacy, and courtly manners, Alexander possessed an unusual curiosity about the lives of common people. His father, King Edmund, was a stern but fair ruler who believed that a king's duty was to protect his people from afar, to make wise decisions from the throne room, and to maintain the dignity and distance that royalty required. A king must be like the sun, he would tell young Alexander. Warm and necessary, but too close and you burn, too far and you freeze. We must maintain our proper distance. But Alexander's mother, Queen Isabella, who had grown up in a small village before her rare beauty caught the king's eye, often told him different stories. She spoke of the satisfaction of harvest time, the community of neighbors helping one another, and the honest pride of creating something with your own hands. She died when Alexander was 12, and her death left a hollow place in both father and son, a wound that neither knew how to heal. As Alexander grew into a young man, he became increasingly troubled by what he saw from his palace windows. The kingdom was prosperous, but prosperity was unevenly distributed. Nobles lived in luxury while farmers worked dawn to dusk for barely enough to survive. When drought came or harvests failed, it was the common people who starved while the palace granaries remained full. On his 21st birthday, when tradition demanded he begin taking on royal responsibilities, Alexander made a request that shocked the court. "Father," he said during a private audience, "I wish to leave the palace for 1 year and live as a common farmer." King Edmund's face turned crimson. "Absurd. A prince does not dig in the dirt like a peasant. Your duty is here, learning to rule." "How can I rule people whose lives I don't understand?" Alexander argued. "I've read every book in our library about agriculture and economics, but I've never planted a seed or felt the weight of true hunger. I want to know what it means to depend on the harvest for survival." The argument raged for weeks. The court was divided. Some advisors thought the prince had gone mad. Others whispered that perhaps this showed wisdom beyond his years. Finally, the king made a bargain. "1 season," he declared. "You will go in disguise to a farming village for 1 planting and harvest season. If you survive it and still believe this was worthwhile, we will discuss what comes next. But you will take no money, no guards, no special treatment. You will be truly on your own." And so, on a spring morning, Prince Alexander left the palace dressed in rough homespun clothes, carrying nothing but a small pack with a change of clothing and a water skin. He had let his beard grow and his hair go uncut. To anyone who saw him, he was simply a young man named Alex, seeking work in the farming village of Greenhaven. Greenhaven was a modest village of perhaps 200 souls, surrounded by fields and orchards. Alexander arrived at midday, dusty from the road, and made his way to the village square where workers were often hired. An older farmer named Thomas, whose weathered face spoke of 50 years in the sun, looked him up and down skeptically. "You've got soft hands," Thomas observed. "Ever worked a farm before?" "No, sir," Alexander admitted. "But I'm strong and willing to learn." Thomas snorted. "Willing don't harvest wheat, boy. But I'm short a hand since my son went to try his fortune in the city. I'll give you a trial. Room in the barn, 1 meal a day, and a copper coin a week if you prove worth keeping." Alexander soon discovered that farming was brutally harder than any training he'd endured in the palace. He woke before dawn to feed animals, mucked out stables until his back screamed in protest, and spent hours behind a plow that seemed determined to veer into every rock and root in the field. His soft hands blistered, then bled, then calloused. His muscles ached in places he didn't know he had muscles. But he also discovered something unexpected: satisfaction. There was something pure about the work, a direct connection between effort and result. When he finally managed to plough a straight furrow, Thomas gave him a rare nod of approval, and Alexander felt more pride than he'd ever felt receiving praise for his swordsmanship or poetry. He befriended the other villagers. There was Sarah, Thomas's daughter, a sharp-witted young woman who managed the household and vegetable garden with remarkable efficiency. Her younger brother Peter had been injured in an accident that left him with a limp, ending his dreams of becoming a soldier. Maria and John, a young couple in the next farm, were expecting their first child. Old William, the village elder, was a font of stories and practical wisdom. Through the planting season, Alexander learned about the rhythms of agricultural life. He learned which crops to plant when, how to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals, how to mend tools and improvise solutions with limited resources. He learned about community, how neighbors came together for barn raisings and harvests, how they shared what they had in times of shortage. He also learned about their struggles. Thomas explained how the king's tax collectors came each harvest and took a portion of the crop, regardless of whether the harvest was good or poor. 3 years ago, we had early frost, lost half the wheat. Taxman still took his share. Some families nearly starved that winter. That's not right, Alexander said, his heart heavy with guilt. He'd never realized the system worked this way. Right or not, it's the law, Thomas said with resignation. The king sits in his palace and don't know nothing about what it's like to watch your children go hungry because of a bad harvest. The nobles, they got reserves, they got other income. Us, we live or die by what grows. As summer progressed, Alexander threw himself into his work with new intensity. He wasn't just learning farming, he was learning about the real consequences of the laws and policies made in his father's throne room. He saw how the village had no healer because they couldn't afford to pay one. He saw how Peter's injury had never properly healed because there was no money for proper treatment. He saw how Sarah, despite her intelligence, would never have the education she deserved because there were no schools for common children. Then came the crisis that would test everything Alexander had learned. In late summer, word came that a band of raiders from across the northern border was moving through the countryside, burning and looting. The king's soldiers were 3 days away, occupied with defending a noble's estate. Greenhaven and several other farming villages were on their own. The village meeting that night was tense. Some wanted to flee into the forest. Others wanted to try to hide their valuables and hope the raiders passed by. It was Alexander who stood up with a different proposal. We can defend ourselves, he said. I've had military training. If we work together, use the terrain to our advantage, we can hold them off until the king's soldiers arrive. Military training? Thomas looked at him suspiciously. I thought you said you were just a farmhand looking for work. Alexander hesitated, then made a decision. I haven't been entirely truthful about my past. I served in the Lord's household guard before. Before I decided I wanted a different life. But I know tactics, and I know defense. Please, let me help. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps they heard the sincerity in his voice, but the villagers agreed to try his plan. Alexander organized them efficiently. They dug trenches across the main road, set up positions with makeshift weapons, arranged signals for communication. He placed their few archers where they'd have the best vantage points and organized the farmers with their scythes and pitchforks into defensive positions. When the raiders came, expecting easy prey, they found instead a coordinated defense that stalled their advance. Alexander led from the front, his sword skills coming back instinctively. The raiders, surprised by the resistance and realizing the pickings wouldn't be easy, retreated when the king's soldiers finally arrived. The village celebrated their survival, but now they looked at Alex differently. His fighting skills, his leadership, his command of tactics had revealed he was no ordinary farmhand. Thomas confronted him that evening. Who are you really, boy? Alexander looked around at the faces of the people who had become his friends, his community. He thought of his father's words about maintaining distance, about being like the sun. But he thought too of his mother's stories, of Sarah's intelligence that would go unused, of Peter's injury that needn't have left him crippled, of all the good people whose lives were shaped by decisions made by those who didn't understand them. "My name is Alexander," he said quietly. "Prince Alexander. I came here to learn what it meant to be a farmer, to understand the lives of my future subjects. But I learned so much more than that." The revelation sent shockwaves through the village. Some were angry at the deception, others were frightened about what it might mean. But Sarah, who had worked beside him all summer, spoke up. "He's worked as hard as any of us. He's bled in our fields, shared our meals, defended our homes. He's not a prince who came to play at being poor. He's someone who came to learn, and then used what he knew to save us. That counts for something." Over the next few days, as word spread through the region, Alexander found himself in long conversations with the villagers about what life was really like for them. He took notes, asked questions, listened to their suggestions. When his father's representatives finally arrived to bring him home, he had a pack full of journals filled with observations and ideas. His return to the palace was not triumphant but thoughtful. King Edmund looked at his son, noting the calloused hands, the sun-darkened skin, the new confidence in his bearing. "Well?" the king asked. "Father," Alexander said, "I learned that we have been ruling from ignorance. Good intentions are not enough when we don't understand the consequences of our policies. The tax system needs reform. We need village healers and schools. We need better protection for outlying areas. We need to listen to the people we govern, not just tell them what we think they need." "And you learn this by shoveling manure?" the king asked dryly. "I learned this by living the life of someone affected by our decisions," Alexander replied, "by feeling in my own body what it means to face hunger, danger, and hardship with only the resources available to a common farmer." "Father, the kingdom is only as strong as its weakest parts. If we want Meridian to truly prosper, we need to understand and support all our people, not just the nobles." What followed were years of careful, persistent reform. Alexander didn't transform the kingdom overnight. Change came slowly, often against resistance from nobles who benefited from the old system. But bit by bit, policies shifted. A progressive tax system was implemented, lighter on poor harvests, proportional to income. Village schools were established. Regional healers were trained and supported. Infrastructure improved in rural areas. Alexander made it a practice to spend time each year in different parts of the kingdom, not in disguise now but openly, working alongside people, listening to their concerns, understanding their lives. He became known as the Farmer Prince, a title he wore with more pride than any courtly honorific. When he eventually became king, years later, he ruled with a wisdom grounded in real experience. He had advisors from all levels of society, not just nobles. He made decisions based on how they would affect actual lives, not abstract principles. And every spring, he could be found in one of the palace gardens, planting seeds with his own still calloused hands, remembering the lessons learned in the wheat fields of Greenhaven. The story of the Farmer Prince became legend, told and retold. But its true legacy wasn't just in the specific reforms or policies. It was in the reminder that good leadership requires understanding, that wisdom comes from experience, and that sometimes the view from the field reveals more truth than the view from the throne.